power is intoxicating. But when it becomes absolute, unchecked, unquestioned, and eternal, it does more than corrupt. It twists reality itself. Across centuries, kings sat on golden thrones with entire nations bending at their command, and yet behind the jeweled crowns and velvet robes, their minds unraveled in ways more terrifying than any battlefield. These rulers didn't just issue strange orders or indulge in odd quirks, they turned their kingdoms into theaters of madness. One believed his bones were glass, another staged military trials for rats. Some drowned hundreds of concubines in jealous rage, while others laughed themselves to death or ate until their stomachs ruptured. These weren't legends, but real monarchs, documented in court records, diaries, and terrified ambassadors' reports. Tonight, we step inside their courts and chambers to witness 11 kings whose bizarre and insane habits scarred history itself. When James I of England ascended the throne, he brought with him not only a reputation as a scholar and patron of the arts, but also a personal lifestyle so grotesque that it unsettled even the most loyal courtiers. His aversion to water and belief that bathing weakened the body became a defining element of his reign, and soon the royal palace reeked of neglect. For months he would avoid washing, allowing lice to swarm through his hair until they grew so numerous that attendants swore they could hear them crawling when they stood near him. His mouth, already decayed from a diet drenched in sugared fruits, produced a stench so overwhelming that foreign ambassadors wrote home in disgust, describing private audiences with the king as unbearable ordeals. His garments, layered silks and velvets once meant to display magnificence, turned into stained and greasy rags, heavy with food, sweat, and filth, while courtiers positioned themselves carefully upwind whenever ceremonies forced them close. This was not ignorance of hygiene, for James was highly educated and fully aware of European standards of cleanliness, but rather a deliberate assertion of privilege, a declaration that the king stood above rules that governed ordinary men. Diplomacy itself suffered, for foreign envoys carried back tales of the foul-smelling sovereign, damaging England's prestige abroad. His court became a prison of odor and humiliation, where no one dared confront the monarch about his revolting habits, proving that absolute power could not only erode judgment, but force an entire kingdom to endure one man's descent into filth. In the annals of European history, few rulers embody the fragility of the human mind more completely than Charles VI of France, remembered forever as the monarch who believed his body was made entirely of glass. For more than 3 decades, the French court functioned under the shadow of this bizarre delusion, as Charles demanded that everyone around him treat him as though the slightest touch or sudden movement might shatter him into countless pieces. He ordered iron rods to be sewn into his garments to act as a protective cage, forcing himself to carry the weight of clothing that was heavy and cumbersome, yet in his mind necessary to keep his fragile body from breaking. He refused handshakes, recoiled from embraces, and insisted on padded chairs and cushioned bedding, believing that even turning in his sleep might cause catastrophic damage. Court life slowed to a surreal pantomime as ministers and ambassadors attempted to conduct serious affairs of state with a king who froze in terror, unwilling to walk across stone floors or mount a horse. Servants stripped the royal chambers of hard objects, leaving rooms barren so that nothing could threaten their sovereign's imagined fragility. Diplomats from across Europe returned home bewildered, reporting the impossibility of negotiating with a monarch who thought himself crystalline, while France's enemies quietly rejoiced at a kingdom paralyzed by delusion. The tragedy was not only personal but national, for during his reign France faced war and crisis, yet its ruler remained trapped in an invisible prison of glass, leaving a kingdom to crumble while its king trembled at the fear of breaking. When Peter III inherited the vast Russian throne in 1762, the empire expected a ruler of strength and vision. But what it received instead was a man whose mind remained trapped in the world of childhood, a sovereign so consumed by toys and make-believe that statecraft itself became an elaborate game. Each morning he would retreat into chambers filled with miniature armies, complete with cannons, cavalry, and infantry, arranging and rearranging them for hours, as if the fate of Russia depended not on strategy or diplomacy, but on the placement of wooden soldiers on a table. Ministers and generals, men hardened by decades of war and experience, were made to crawl across palace floors on hands and knees to play the roles of toy infantry, their humiliation a testament to how absolute power could degrade the dignity of even the most capable. His obsession stretched further into grotesque displays when he staged full tribunals for rats accused of crimes like desertion, complete with charges, witnesses, and formal sentences, ending with executions on tiny gallows specially built for the emperor's entertainment. Diplomats summoned to discuss treaties found themselves speaking to a monarch distracted by sandboxes and toy cannons, as if the destiny of Europe could be decided by childlike imagination. Orders to real regiments were sometimes based not on actual campaigns, but on the results of these miniature battles, plunging Russia's military credibility into farce. Within 6 months, his wife Catherine, who would become Catherine the Great, conspired to remove him, ending a reign that had turned the empire into a nursery and proving that childish fantasies, when wielded by a king, could imperil the stability of an entire nation. King Farouk of Egypt, who ascended the throne in 1936 as one of the wealthiest monarchs of the Middle East, should have been a symbol of modern Arab leadership, yet he became infamous for habits so compulsive and bizarre that they reduced his reign to an international spectacle of ridicule. Farouk possessed an uncontrollable urge to steal, and despite his unimaginable riches, he pilfered watches from the wrists of dinner guests, snatched pens from the pockets of foreign ambassadors, and even once took a timepiece from the hand of Winston Churchill, a theft so brazen that it spread across the world and humiliated Egypt in British circles. His obsessions extended beyond theft into a pathological love of red cars, amassing a collection of more than 200 vehicles painted in shades of crimson, and even rewriting Egyptian law to ban ordinary citizens from owning cars of the same color, a decree that turned his fixation into state policy. Within the walls of his palaces, Farouk's indulgences became darker, as he oversaw the world's largest private collection of pornography and gorged himself on endless feasts until obesity left him barely able to function as a sovereign. His harem swelled with hundreds of women, many kept against their will, forced into a life of terror to satisfy the king's endless appetites. While the nation struggled with poverty, political unrest, and the rising tide of revolution, their monarch squandered resources to feed cravings he could never control, and in the end, his compulsions did not simply disgrace him, but hastened the collapse of the Egyptian monarchy itself. King Martin of Aragon, remembered as one of the more genial rulers of medieval Spain, proved that even joy taken to excess could turn fatal when combined with the overindulgence of a sovereign whose life had long been governed by luxury. And his end remains one of the strangest deaths in royal history. During a lavish feast celebrating the spoils of a successful hunt, Martin devoured course after course of roasted meats, pastries, and rich wines until his stomach swelled to the point of agony. Yet instead of retiring to his chambers to recover, he lingered in the hall where one of his courtiers, seeking to entertain the king, told a joke so absurdly comic that it sent the monarch into a fit of uncontrollable laughter. What began as harmless amusement spiraled into violent convulsions as the king's diaphragm spasmed, his face reddened and then turned purple, and his body shook under the strain of both the massive meal and the relentless waves of laughter that refused to stop. Medieval physicians, unprepared for such a bizarre crisis, could do little but watch as their sovereign gasped for breath, the food he had consumed pressing against his organs while his lungs and heart strained to keep rhythm with his convulsions. The laughter that had once filled the hall with merriment transformed into a grotesque spectacle of impending death, and after hours of torment the king collapsed, his body broken not by war or treachery, but by indulgence and amusement, leaving his court stunned by the irony that joy itself had become the weapon that killed their ruler. Christian VII of Denmark, who came to the throne in 1766 at the age of 17, quickly revealed himself to be a monarch whose mind unraveled so profoundly that his reign became a nightmare not only for his courtiers but for the entire kingdom, as his erratic behavior transformed royal authority into a spectacle of humiliation and fear. His violent impulses struck without warning. He would lash out at ministers, attendants, and even visiting dignitaries with whatever object was within reach, turning audiences that should have been ceremonial displays of dignity into terrifying eruptions of madness. His obsessions were equally grotesque, as he forced ambassadors, generals, and elderly statesmen to play endless games of leapfrog, and anyone who hesitated or failed to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm faced his furious outbursts, so that serious matters of state dissolved into childish play. He extended his eccentricities further by elevating his pet dog to the status of government minister, complete with salary, seat at council, and even ceremonial honors, creating scenes in which foreign envoys watched with disbelief as the king consulted an animal about policy. His sexual behavior became increasingly shameless, exposing himself in public, harassing courtiers regardless of gender or rank, and reducing ceremonies into grotesque displays that damaged Denmark's reputation across Europe. At meals he devoured food with his hands, threw scraps on the floor, and at times consumed garbage or refused nourishment entirely in paranoid fear of poison, leaving his body weakened while his mind deteriorated further. Ultimately, his physician Struensee exploited his madness to control the kingdom, creating a constitutional crisis that left Denmark in turmoil and proving that one man's broken mind could paralyze an entire nation. Few rulers in recorded history embody the lethal madness of unchecked power more vividly than Caligula, the Roman emperor whose 4 years on the throne from 37 to 41 AD became synonymous with cruelty, delusion, and grotesque self-worship. For he not only believed himself to be divine, but also attempted to transform the entire empire into a stage where his fantasies could be performed at the expense of millions. Convinced that his beloved horse Incitatus was more intelligent and loyal than the senators who surrounded him, he lavished upon the animal a marble stable, an ivory manger, and jeweled collars, and he openly declared his intention to make the creature a consul of Rome, a proposal so outrageous that it both terrified and humiliated the political class, yet none dared laugh for fear of execution. Caligula's own delusions of godhood went further still, as he paraded through the city dressed alternately as Jupiter, Apollo, Diana, or even Venus, demanding temples be erected to his worship and ordering sacrifices in his name, so that citizens who once bowed before timeless deities now had to kneel before a deranged man wrapped in theatrical costumes. He argued with statues, conversed with marble gods, and claimed to receive their counsel, using these supposed revelations to justify decrees that were violent, irrational, and catastrophic. Public events became arenas of terror, as the emperor might at any moment halt a speech to announce his divine will, order executions on a whim, or demand immediate worship from those present. His reign ended only when his own guards, recognizing that Rome itself could not endure his insanity, cut him down, leaving behind a legacy that stands as one of history's most chilling warnings of how absolute power can consume a man until he ceases to be human at all. Ludwig II of Bavaria, often romanticized today as the creator of the enchanting castles that still crown the German landscape, was in truth a monarch whose mind had drifted so completely into fantasy that he ceased to rule in any practical sense, transforming his kingdom into a stage for operatic illusions that consumed its wealth and crippled its government. Obsessed with medieval chivalry, myth, and the music of Richard Wagner, Ludwig spent his nights dressed in elaborate costumes, wandering torchlit halls while acting out scenes from sagas and operas, convinced he was himself a knight or a hero from legend. He ordered banquets to be prepared for long-dead kings and queens, with servants required to lay tables, pour wine, and serve courses to empty chairs, while he raised toasts and held conversations with phantoms that existed only in his imagination. His greatest obsession manifested in his construction projects, most famously Neuschwanstein Castle, a breathtaking monument not to governance but to personal fantasy, where turrets, frescoes, and chambers were designed as though for a fairy tale kingdom rather than a functioning state. The cost of these architectural dreams nearly bankrupted Bavaria, draining resources that should have gone to schools, armies, and infrastructure, while ministers wrung their hands in despair as their king retreated further into his mythic world. He refused to engage with politics, ignored the sweeping industrial changes of 19th-century Europe, and lived increasingly at night, disconnected from reality, until he was finally declared insane and found drowned under mysterious circumstances in Lake Starnberg, his death as enigmatic and unreal as the fantasies that had consumed his reign. Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire, remembered by history with the chilling title Ibrahim the Mad, ruled between 1640 and 1648 in a reign that combined grotesque sexual obsession with violent paranoia, creating an atmosphere so terrifying that his own government ultimately deemed him too dangerous to live. Raised for most of his youth in the Golden Cage, a secluded prison within the palace where potential heirs were confined to prevent threats to the throne, Ibrahim emerged from decades of isolation warped by deprivation, and once he inherited absolute power, his long-repressed desires exploded with horrifying consequences. He became fixated on women of extreme size, sending agents throughout the empire with orders to find the heaviest women possible, offering rewards for those who could locate candidates for his insatiable appetites, and reducing human beings to catalogued measurements of weight and girth. His harem, unlike the carefully structured institution maintained by previous sultans, devolved into a dungeon of terror, where hundreds of women lived under constant fear of being summoned, and many perished from the violence of his demands. In one of the most infamous episodes of royal cruelty, Ibrahim, consumed by jealousy and convinced that his concubines had been unfaithful, ordered the mass drowning of nearly 300 women, their bodies sewn into weighted sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus, an atrocity so vast that it shocked even hardened courtiers. His delusions extended beyond the harem, covering palace walls in rare furs to satisfy tactile cravings, and squandering imperial wealth on bizarre indulgences while the empire suffered. At last, terrified ministers and clerics conspired to depose and execute him, concluding that the survival of the state required the death of a sovereign whose unchecked madness had transformed desire into systematic mass violence. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China and one of the most powerful figures in world history, spent his reign attempting to conquer the only enemy he could never defeat, death itself. And in his obsession to achieve immortality, he ultimately consumed the very poison that killed him, leaving behind a legacy as tragic as it was monumental. Terrified of mortality, he filled his court with alchemists and mystics whose survival depended on feeding his delusions, and so they devised elaborate rituals and concoctions that promised eternal life while secretly eroding his health. Mercury, misunderstood as a purifying element, became the centerpiece of his daily regimen, ingested in pills and elixirs that he believed would transform his flesh into something divine, and he swallowed these toxins with religious devotion, while his body slowly deteriorated under their corrosive power. His paranoia grew alongside his illness, and he began sleeping in different palaces each night, traveling in identical carriages to conceal his location, and executing anyone suspected of betraying his movements, creating a climate of terror that paralyzed his court. At the same time, he poured unimaginable resources into the construction of his colossal tomb, guarded by the Terracotta Army, a force of thousands of clay soldiers crafted to protect him in the afterlife, an irony that revealed he feared death even as he claimed to defeat it. When he finally collapsed on a journey in the eastern provinces, his advisors hid his death, surrounding his decomposing body with rotting fish to mask the stench, a grotesque final scene for a ruler whose quest for eternity had turned him into a living victim of poison long before the grave claimed him. Adolf Frederick of Sweden, remembered less for political achievements and more for the grotesque circumstances of his death, entered history as the monarch who ate himself to death, a man whose unchecked appetites embodied the fatal extremes of royal indulgence. On Shrove Tuesday in 1771, the king sat down to a feast that seemed endless, consuming enormous portions of lobster, caviar, kippers, sauerkraut, champagne, and a host of other delicacies until he had already surpassed what any ordinary body could endure. Yet it was the dessert that transformed this gluttonous celebration into a tragedy. He devoured 14 servings of semla, heavy cream-filled pastries rich with almond paste and sweetbread that swelled inside his stomach as they absorbed liquid, pressing mercilessly against organs already strained by the meal. What began as discomfort escalated into agony as his distended stomach ruptured under the pressure, and medieval physicians, helpless before such a crisis, could only watch as their sovereign writhed in torment for hours, gasping for relief that never came. His final moments, far from the dignity of a warrior king or enlightened monarch, were spent in humiliation, doubled over from excess while courtiers whispered in horror at the spectacle of a man destroyed by his own cravings. Across Europe, news of his death spread with equal parts shock and dark amusement, and he was remembered not for governance, but as the king whose greed literally consumed him, a symbol of how absolute privilege without restraint could turn even the act of eating into a weapon of self-destruction, across centuries and across continents. The stories of these 11 kings reveal a single truth about absolute authority: when no one can say no to a ruler, when privilege is limitless and consequences absent, the human mind begins to fracture in ways that are both grotesque and terrifying. Some, like Charles VI, trap themselves in fragile delusions, while others, like Ibrahim I or Caligula, turned their madness outward and inflicted horrors upon their subjects. For some, appetite itself became the instrument of ruin, as in the cases of Martin of Aragon, Adolf Frederick of Sweden, and Henry VIII, whose cravings literally consumed their bodies. Others escaped into fantasy, like Ludwig II, or into the poisonous pursuit of immortality, like Qin Shi Huang, each demonstrating that unchecked power does not simply corrupt, but systematically dismantles judgment, restraint, and even humanity itself. These were not mythical tyrants, but real sovereigns, and their insane habits destroyed not only their reputations, but entire nations that were forced to suffer under their collapse. So as we look back on the bizarre and insane habits of these kings, we are reminded that crowns and thrones may glitter, but behind them often lurks fragility, obsession, and madness that can scar generations. And if these stories fascinated you, do not let the journey end here. There are countless more tales buried in the shadows of history waiting to be uncovered. So make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell, because the past still has darker secrets left to reveal.